if you see recording, there you go. Mon just wouldn't do it until I told you that we were going to do it. So now we're going to record. So Deb and Claudia, I took notes, so we will not lose those awesome answers. But just want to let folks know that I could go on for hours about advice, and I'm going to keep coming back to advice in each section. But I transformation in the middle of a pandemic, like it sounds like an oxymoron. Like, is that even possible? But then in some ways, you absolutely had to transform to survive in the pandemic. Carol, Sally, talk to me about how the pandemic impacted you and anybody else that wants to join. I know, Deb, you have stories there too. But just to get more people in the conversation, Carol, kick us out. Like, I know, but tell people, how did your organization change? And then what kinds of things did you have to do to keep your lights on and keep serving your mission during these times? And how does that help smaller nonprofits?
Yeah, thanks. So I'll try to be quick and try to throw out some things that might be helpful. I quickly realized that this was a moment of sort of chaos and that our staff were feeling like things were falling apart. And so it was important to provide as much structure as one could in a moment of uncertainty, while being authentic and telling the truth as you knew the truth to be. So I think that was really key. And so I used the framework of triage, triage, transition, and transformation as a way to frame the different things that we needed to do. So we had to take some emergency steps immediately. We had students that had to be brought home, hundreds of them. And so there were just things that we had to do. We had to move immediately to make sure that our grants and contracts could keep running. We had to move our programs online. There were so many things that we needed to do, and that was sort of the triage phase. But as we were doing the emergency response, realizing that even then you need to look toward what will you be when we come out of this, what might the future hold, and what can we learn and adapt as we go through that transition, which ultimately at some point will come. You know that it will. And so using some sort of frameworks in which to guide the ways we were thinking about the pandemic, and then also the racial reckoning in the US, I think really helped to ground us in some thoughtful ways to consider all the different things that we had to do.
I'm going to say what Carol didn't, because Carol's organization is primarily funded by global travel. So in the beginning of a pandemic, or not funded, its mission is bringing people from one part of the world physically to another part of the world and back. And so like when you can't, the world is not open, that is like an existential threat to the organization. And I would say I have the honor of working on her board. I think we're coming out. Carol's focus on transition to transformation has been exactly the right one. And she's changed the organization for the better, but it wasn't pretty on day one when they were trying to beg the State Department to fly kids home on planes from around the world. Sally.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to pick up on what Carol said, because it was very chaotic, and you've got a staff of people and they're all rearing to go, but we're all in this never land. We didn't know if we would survive. We didn't know what would happen with the, a lot of people thought the pandemic would be over in 3 months, and it went on and on and on, and everything's shutting down. And, we're a one-on-one kind of organization. We're meeting with people, we're talking to people, we're having lunches, and all of a sudden, all of that comes to a grinding halt. So I would say that we leaned in, because our job is to communicate with consumers and do work with workers as well. One of the first things we did was we got the head of the FDA to come and do a couple of sessions with us about the development of the COVID vaccine. Like, these were in the days where we didn't know if there was ever going to be a vaccine. And Tony Fauci was talking about it being 3 years away. And then all of a sudden things were going much faster, and people were very nervous about it and weren't sure, is this something that we can trust? So we did 2 sessions with Dr. Stephen Hahn to talk to consumers about vaccine. Then we we brought in the American Clinical Labs Association. This is what we do. We talk to consumers. What is this COVID testing stuff? what is a COVID test? How do you do it? Is it, we didn't know it was going to be a nasal swab. Now we all, we're pretty familiar with how it works. How much is it going to cost? Where can we get it? Are we going to, is it going to be invasive? Is it going to be available to everybody across the board? So all this stuff, the Labs Association was able to tell us how they developed them, different kinds of tests, where you can get them. Would we ever have an at-home test? Now that seems like, obvious. Yeah, I just bought one today at CVS, but it wasn't clear in those days. So we began to translate some of that information to consumers. The third thing we did is talk to attorneys general across the country. Jenny was involved with this. We had our key policy guy. There was a big problem with hoarding. All these folks would go online, they buy up all the masks, they buy up the PPE, they buy up the hand sanitizer, and you could go and get hand sanitizer for a little bottle for $25. So there was hoarding and gouging, both of which are against the law. So we got these AGs from states all over the country to sit with us on these Facebook Live events, talk to consumers about what they're seeing and how to report it. And the last thing we did was go after the anti-vax people who were getting PPP loans. We were outraged that the government was spending $10 billion on Operation Warp Speed to develop a vaccine. And through the PPP loan system, the 5 leading anti-vax organizations, all of a sudden, they're getting $850,000. That's taxpayer dollars. That's just wrong. So we used our advocacy chops and when I say lean in, all of this is in the context of consumer advocacy. The last thing we did is do a thing with all of our labor representatives talking about what it's like to be on a frontline worker during COVID. Are they getting the proper protections? What is their voice? The unions were their voice. Are they being safely? Is the workplace a safe place for them? And if so, how do we ensure that we support that? So that's kind of how we began navigating. And as I look back on it, it seemed like a pretty good strategy, given what our mission is.
And exhausting strategy. I mean, with staff working around the clock. So true. So
Sure.
glad that you guys are out there. Emily, I'm going to jump ahead to a question and go to you, and then maybe have Amy jump in too, because both of you guys work a lot about building capacity. But I read this Urban Institute study earlier this year that said that larger organizations kind of did better with giving. So talk a little bit. So I'm going to combine this with another question. Amy, it's different for you, but for Emily, from the nonprofits that you've seen and any of the nonprofit leaders want to jump in on here. Donations, everybody thought no one would have any money and that no one would ever donate to anything. Instead, we saw that people still kept giving. But the Urban Institute study saw that the bigger sort of established nonprofits did a little bit better than the smaller. So Emily, why do you think that happened? And sort of how did your funders think about the pandemic and like what they needed to do in that moment?
Well, I'm going to piggyback on what Sally said, the concept of leaning in. I think regardless of small or large nonprofits, any organizations that were able to really bring those donors, those constituents that were close to the organization closer and bring them on their journey and were transparent throughout the process, were that much more successful. I mean, clearly the reason a larger nonprofit versus a smaller nonprofit was able to be, from my perspective, was able to weather the storm a bit better is because they have their bench is deeper. They're able to go, they have more people that can do more of this leaning in. When you have one development staff member, the person is doing 10 different jobs and it's really challenging. They might actually be, if it's a social service organization, they might be literally pivoting into a role where they're setting up some type of food service and they don't have time to lean into their donors. A larger organization, on the other hand, is able to communicate. So I saw organizations, one of my clients is the National World War I Memorial that just opened in our nation's capital. We were able to continue working throughout the pandemic. So we communicated the fact that we were an essential business. We had construction continuing. We had our sculptor continuing. We were able to tell people that story. And I think that was really helpful. And then we also were able to use the opportunity to host virtual events with access to folks like Admiral Mike Mullen, one of our advisors, who normally we wouldn't have access to. We could pop them onto a Zoom, and guess what? All of a sudden, everybody had access to them. So I think that from the standpoint of nonprofits, those that were really able to had some established funders that they could rely on, some of those bigger funders. And I know we're going to probably talk about unrestricted giving at some point, but when you have some of these established relationships and those funders were more open and understanding to the fact that we don't know what the world holds. We're not going to be able to provide you an impact report on these small gifts with, very specific programmatic elements. We need you to trust us. And so I think many of those organizations that were successful had the trust of their funders and the trust of their donors.
So Amy, sort of taking aside politics, but taking your organization, people kept giving to campaign organizations that were pushing voter edge in the middle of a pandemic election. And you've also worked at your environmental jobs and your education jobs of doing, tell me like kind of what lessons that you've learned or why you think that some of the established groups, I think Emily, I kind of hit the nail on the head there, but anything you want to add on that?
Well, I think what Emily said was really compelling. Like suddenly everybody was on very equal footing and you could have one conversation. I mean, it's kind of interesting to me from I run a very large in terms of dollars nonprofit, but my board's relatively small. Suddenly my board meetings got better because actually we were all just on Zoom as opposed to 3 people on the phone and 2 people on Zoom and 1 person in the room. Like it actually got the communication got better. And then I just think people totally got it. If you presented a compelling case for the funding in the midst of the pandemic and what was needed, you guys, even if you are only on the periphery of doing electoral work, have always heard about get out the vote, GOTV, right? Well, we started talking about spread out the vote. Now we've got to educate people about how to vote early. We've got to give them mailings about requesting absentee ballots. Like, how are we going to do that? And once we made the case, and because we had those established relationships, the money poured in, having a really bad boogeyman also helped. And you guys all know the boogeyman I mean. We'll just leave it at that boogeyman. I don't even talk about him anymore.
But Deb, I just want to quickly jump to you, and then I want to go into another part of transformation that Claudia actually opened with, which is diversity, inclusion, equity. That's a really important part of the mix in terms of transforming. So we're talking money a little bit here and then transforming. But Deb, what are some hard choices that you had to make? I know you had to make some hard choices that you want to talk about, or that the affiliates had to. And you still have a rise during pandemics. I remember this from my time at HHS, or moments of great social upheaval. Unfortunately, DV stats rise when people are under tension. Talk a little bit about like both what the people you serve and your organizations went through.
Sure. And I'm, again, sorry about my background noise. Yeah, I mean, I want to frame this for a moment, which is the advice to the entire globe was to stay at home. That was the solution to COVID. Unfortunately, for the communities that I serve, home is not a safe place. And so we, within 24 hours, had to convene a COVID rapid response team, because we had to serve the 56 coalitions, who had to serve the 2,000 programs, who didn't all have Zoom, who didn't all have laptops, who didn't all have the options to do that, who were not considered essential services, but were essential services and couldn't get PPEs or sanitizers. And it was difficult is an understatement, I think, for the people that we serve. So we did a few things. Like I said, we convened this rapid response team, which was cross-disciplinary. So we had someone who knew how to provide digital services, someone else who knows how to deal with natural disasters, someone else who could provide legal information when courts were shut down. And we were having weekly calls. We provided the first ever national resource hub of its kind. We didn't look at borders of organizations, and we just had everything posted and a place to go. And we normally provide technical assistance for coalitions, for our 56 coalitions, but this just created a whole new element. And we were very fortunate. We have a safety net team, which is a team that looks at the intersection of technology, civil rights, privacy, and domestic violence. And so they were all ready to go and to be able to help everyone provide confidential services online. We also used our platform as a national organization we created a pop-up PPE store. We went to our funders and said, we need help in the field. And we got over 200,000 masks and sanitizers donated. This is not normally what we do. And, excuse me, we went to one of our long-standing funders and got over $1 million in emergency grants that went to the field. I'm losing my voice, sorry, including a focus on culturally specific providers and providers who serve communities of color. So we were doing all kinds of innovative and nimble things, and making some hard choices as well for our own funding structure and internal staff exhaustion as well during that time.
The transformation and like change and like taking a crisis and using it for a moment to sort of reassess and relook is so powerful. And yet we had two things in this, we had lots of things in this country. We had the sort of political mess that Amy implied earlier. We had this crazy disease, but we also had more recognition by people who weren't people of color. But so people who weren't people of color all of a sudden started to hear and listen to, thanks to unfortunately some very tragic moments. It's not like any of these problems are new, and many of you have been working on them for decades and years, and unfortunately we're not there yet. But there was, for better or for worse, some of our funders, some of the corporate sector started to focus more on diversity and inclusion. Claudia, can you start us off? I mean, it's always been something that's been core to you. I think I know I can personally speak for everyone on this call. It's something that's core for every single one of our speakers, but sort of corporate America, I don't know, it's the wrong word, but mainstream or whatever the word is, it all of a sudden other people started to understand a little bit some of the both pain, but also need that was out there. How has it changed sort of since the pandemic with the focus on diversity and inclusion? You know, and then anybody, I know I'm going to call on a couple more of you, but I mean, Claudia, this is something I know you've dedicated your career to, so I wanted to open with you.
So I think you're right. There's not really been a substantive change within organizations. What we've seen is, as you've pointed out, everybody else is seeing the pain that communities of color live with every day. So that from an institutional perspective, what I've observed is that a number of funders are giving money to Black-led organizations, when before, let's be clear, they would make those organizations jump through bigger hoops, higher hoops and bigger hoops. And so that sort of notion of who should be leading organizations has changed. My hope is that it will continue to, it will stay. It will not just be a thing, you know, a hip thing to do. I think we've seen now that 3 out of 4 of the major civil rights organizations are now run by African-American women. And when we talk about centering Black women, those close to the pain should be close to the power, right? So that's part of using D&I as part of a transformational conversation. And internally, organizations like the ones on this call need to do the hard work of what it means to have difficult conversations. So while we saw the really horrible things that were public, folks of color deal with that kind of trauma on a day-to-day basis. From having children that you worry about making it safely home before 2020. Young women who are the targets of domestic violence, not bringing charges because they're afraid that the men will then find themselves in the criminal legal system. What do we do about that? Reproductive freedom and what it means for Black women, women of color who don't have access. And you know, I must say that a lot of the systems that we all want to change really are not new. You know, the fight about critical race theory was the same fight about desegregating schools when I was a kid. Those same cranky parents were doing the same things years ago. So it's when you challenge power, we have to be really intentional and own that we need to challenge power. And some of us may not need to be in charge going forward for a whole host of reasons having to do with our privilege, either whether it's race or gender or gender identity. So it's going to call for reflection and holding ourselves and those who give us money accountable too, because we can't have it just be a cool thing to do for the next couple of years.
So I'm going to go quickly to Emily because one of our speakers is stuck on a train and can't make it. And Emily is directly working with her, which is Karma Kottman, who is a board member of NNDV. She used to run the DC Coalition to End Domestic Violence. She worked on the library. She's one of those amazing women. She's starting, she started and is building a nonprofit to help prevent violence for Black women called UGIMA. And Emily, do you want to just do a quick little thing on your work with her, just so everybody gets a flavor of, since we don't have Karma yet?
Oh, sure. So it's a great organization. And as you mentioned, she's in the beginning process of determining her private philanthropy strategy. So historically, it's been an organization funded with primarily government funds, and she understands that there's a lot of money to tap into right now in the private philanthropy space. So we've been working with her on a strategy around corporations, foundations, and eventually individuals that we can reach out to for resources. So we've been looking at, we know that there's funds out there. We know that, just as Claudia said, organizations, funders are making this a priority. City Foundation asks organizations now, requires not just organizations, but they ask about their board makeup, they ask about your hiring practices. It's really, so there, I think my sense is, and I hope this is true, Claudia, that this is not just a moment in time, but this is the new trend going forward. So for Karma, though, we are really having, I think we have, she has a very interesting story to tell, and we have are in the process of cultivating conversations with the likes of the NFL or MLB or some of those some funders that we know might be interested and would be interested in telling their story and what they're doing, specifically around Black women and domestic violence. So it's a really wonderful organization. It's really an exciting time for her, and it's a small but mighty board of about 7 individuals. And so yeah, I'm sorry that Karma is not here. I have a meeting with her tomorrow. She's really stuck on that train. She's a great leader, and Deb, I see you smiling there. You know her as well. So that's my plug for UGIMA. So if you have an opportunity to take a look at the great work that they're doing, I think she has a really wonderful platform right now, and there's a lot of funders that are interested in what they're doing.
All right, so I'm unfortunately looking at time, and I'm going to take some questions, but I'm going to go to Sally and Carol to talk quickly about challenges and opportunities facing women leading nonprofits. So I'm going to kick it off with Carol, you first, because you have to work globally where there's different perceptions of women. You've got to work, you've got an organization that part of your organization goes to try to get kids that are 15 and 16 to do exchanges, but you have an older board, and there's, so you run the gamut in everything you do. What have been some challenges and opportunities that are facing women and women leaders? And World Learning does a lot of training for women leaders, especially women leaders in education. So you've seen this all over the world.
That is quite a question.
I know, I'm sorry.
Well, let me just say this, that a couple thoughts, which are, one, that, women we're all very different. There's not one, all over the globe. I will go and meet with a group of women, and they will be so sort of surprised that I'm the head of an organization. I can go to another country, and it's everywhere I go, pretty much the only people I see running an organization, or at least nonprofits, are women. And so it's all very different. And so I think for me, what's been really most important is to recognize those differences, the obstacles that people face in one environment, and you can bring that back into the US, are not going to be the same in one community, in one state. They're all very different, but at the same time, just the recognition that there have been so many obstacles put in the path of women in the United States, if I just bring it back to this country, and so much opportunity has come our way in many cases, and just to embrace that and to use perhaps the lessons that have been learned in all that has been done to make it possible for women to succeed in this country in many instances, can be applied in other settings, and to just be sort of grateful for the change that's been made, but know that there's still a lot more work to be done. And that, again, just to recognize in an international organization that each situation is different, and to just bring your authentic self to the situation and just be honest with people about what you're experiencing. So those are just a few thoughts.
That's great. And you really do have such a unique perspective. I can only imagine. Sally, talk a little bit. When I was preparing our speakers, I had shared a story of a friend of Sally's who is the founder of the Bail Project, who had this quote that said, "My advice is the same for all women, whether they're thinking about entering the nonprofit or for-profit world. Despite movement forward, there will be gender-specific barriers in you or becoming a leader. Some are internal, the voices we hear inside our heads and the stories we tell ourselves about our own competency. But some are external, the still prevalent boys' club, systems of inclusion, rank sexism, and of course, harassment. Stay focused, work hard, and remain kind. Find those unwavering people you want in your lifeboat." So, Sally, I'm going to have you answer about 2 minutes on this. I'm going to then do a closing question. We don't have any questions yet. Anne's asked for them, but I want to have you all have a chance to say one more thing. But Sally, you and I talked for about an hour and a half just about this quote on Friday night. Tell me a little bit about what you've learned. You're on mute, though. I have to unmute you. There we go. There we go.
There we go. Robin Steinberg, whose quote you just used, happens to be a family friend and one of my heroes. And first of all, let me say that I'm the kind of person who has always put my head down, assumed that there was no sexism. I'm just going to go do my job. If there is sexism, I'm ignoring it, because once you start raising it, people get nervous and they don't like it. And so, but strangely enough, Anne's husband, who's a friend of mine, Eric Vaughn, once asked me during a public forum, he said, "Tell me about the sexism and misogyny you run into in your career." And I was completely tongue-tied. I was like, I never even think about it. But Robin's quote and some things that have happened with me, when you get into trouble, I think it's easier to beat up on women. If things don't go exactly as they're supposed to go, I think that there's a tendency to take some pot shots at women that you might not do to men. And that actually, I happen to know that happened to Robin Steinberg. And so that quote is very, very important and powerful to me. And she did nothing wrong, but it's a long story that we'll talk about some other time. But I saw it sort of up close and personal with her. But I do think there's subtle sexism, and sort of you kind of got to do your job and can't really get stuck on that too much. But I've certainly seen it. But the good part about being a woman leader is we are role models to the young women that we work with and the young men we work with. I love being the head of a consumer organization that it's mostly a pretty male world. It's a pretty white male world. It's a pretty white world anyway, which is a problem. And we need to do a much better job of expanding our horizons and certainly addressing the needs of consumers of color and involving them and incorporating them into our work and on our boards and on our staff, something that's been very important to me. But we do bring a real fresh look at things, because we've been the victims of discrimination ourselves over the years. And I really love that role that we play. I love working with all of you. It's really fun to work with a lot of powerful, inspiring women. I'm inspired by all of you. And I will end by saying, if you want somebody in your lifeboat, Jenny Backus is my number one choice. She has been such a good friend and such a good sounding board and loyal, and she gets it. And so we need more Jenny Backuses in the world to help us through some of the tough times. And we're all going to find that one person that Robin Steinberg talked about in her quote, and we're going to hold them close. So thanks for the question.
Well, thanks. And Shadow, there's 75 to 80 mentors sitting on this phone call for all of you that want to help you in your lifeboats too. I'm going to actually take that question and build it. So the end, I was going to have you guys all give Impact 100 some advice, but I'm going to combine this into a double question, which is, we started with transformation, we're ending with transformation, but also support. Like, The part of Robin's quote that also really struck me, because this has happened to me all the head, those voices that you hear inside your head. I call it my Sunday night heebie-jeebies. Like you wake up and you're like, I screwed up this week. What did I do wrong? You know, you just can't get it out of your head. You doubt that you're good enough. It's not something I see. I have a fabulous husband. It's not something that he doesn't stay up and in the middle of the night, second guessing his decisions that he made, because probably it's a little bit his own personality, but it's a little bit the gender differences. So talk about, what do you do personally to sort of get over those moments of doubt when it gets all scary and dark? And then also, what advice would you give little groups like ours? Like, what's the most successful thing for members? So members equal fundraising in some senses for us, but we also need members to do the work. We also offer scholarships for members. But what are some things that you would tell to Anne and the fabulous board and members that are listening here about how to bring members in our old organizing tricks? I'm looking at Amy. I've done lots of organizing with you. I'm going to start with you again.
I was thinking about this a lot this week, and I do think women, I mean, I think we have to acknowledge women are held to a higher standard. We get to mess up less. We just do. Like, that's just the reality. We can be successful, but we got to work harder. And one of the kind of mantras that's been running through my mind that I deal with my board, I really try and think through and not surprise people. I'd rather tell people bad news really early, even if it's not going to come true. And that has been very successful, especially in the nonprofit world. Will the money come? Won't the money come? Will this project launch? Won't this project launch? When I kind of get the spidey sense that things aren't going well, I'm as optimistic as I am. I try and let folks know so there are no surprises. That's been, because I just, and you know, I bet Ed can get away with more surprises than you can, Jenny. Like, I just feel like that's a reality of it, but that's what I've been thinking about a little bit lately.
Great. That's good advice. Claudia.
I actually go to the folks in my boat and talk to them and kind of think about, you know, whether I ask them, am I crazy? Am I not? And then go from there. And then, you know, old school Southern kid. I work twice as hard to look half as good as the folks that I'm for, because as a Black woman, that's just the way it is. And so I just assume I'm gonna have to work a little bit harder, even in the social justice space, because the assumption is that I don't know what I'm doing.
Well, you definitely do know what you're doing. So I'm in your boat. Deb.
You know, it's such an interesting question because I went into the field of gender and racial justice. I didn't think I was going to face some of those, perhaps, right? Because it's not like I'm trying to forge a field in a predominantly white male world. I mean, I started my career there, but that's not where I am. But I've had significant barriers coming up to this point. I was sexually harassed out of a job that I loved. I've had I've had sex discrimination in pay and reviews and treatment. It's been a little strange, but it's never gotten to me. It's never caused self-doubt. There's other things that have caused self-doubt, but that has never caused self-doubt because I'm an employment discrimination attorney, because I'm a civil rights attorney. I can see what's happening in the process, and I had to fight my way through it. But now as a CEO, I feel very, very lucky because I am modeling all the practices that I fought for as for employees, right? So I'm looking at compensation structure, I'm looking at implicit bias, I'm looking at promotions and things like that. So, I mean, I have very dark nights and lots of stress, as you know, as a board member, and I've done what Amy has done and gone to you as soon as I'm worried about something. And there's lots of things that get to me personally where staff is unhappy, but it doesn't shake my faith in myself as a woman leader. It may shake my faith in other ways, but it is about having lifeboats. It is about having Jenny on my board. It is things like that. And so it is really tough. And I don't think we can ever ever say that even though we work, be naive as I was, that when you work in this field, these things aren't there. They are absolutely there. And one thing that Claudia said, that we all are looking at systemic change, but we have to be careful because we are referring people that we serve back to systems that fail them because of racism, because of sexism. And so we do have to have a reflective moment in all of our work, and it's super, super hard. And I will just end, I know I'm taking too long, on the last thing about how to grow your membership. I would also just say that people at this time feel a little disconnected and even perhaps a little helpless because it's a very, very difficult time. And so I think this organization has an opportunity to message around a narrative that your membership comes together in a giving circle to really be the change that you want to see in the world. And I think that's a winning story no matter when it happens.
Oh, you're mute.
I'm muted. I was saying you're awesome, Deb. That's such an amazing message. Something Amy said just made me think of Carol a little bit when you were just talking about sort of transformational. Carol, do you want to go? And then we'll end with Sally and we'll go with Emily after Carol.
Yeah, thanks. Well, when I have those dark moments, I'll start with that. I just remember I am good enough. I will face the issue at hand directly. I can analyze it. I can use the advice and guidance of people who are wise to help me look at that. And once I have done that, as my mom would say, put it in a box, close the box, lock the box, and stop. Just stop. Don't obsess and don't spend unnecessary time worrying over it as long as you have faced it with your full self and you've done exactly what you can do to deal with the issue. And I just would advise we all women have to stick together and really support each other when we face those moments. And then in terms of what organizations can do, exactly what you've done, Jenny, is bring some of us together, provide a means for us to get to know each other and just keep making those introductions, because it's amazing to have these opportunities, and just more of them are going to build our networks.
That's such a great, and it's so true. I feel that way. I really honestly wish we were all live somewhere. We could all sit around a table. Emily.
Okay, well, as far as I think we all have that self-doubt sometimes, and I think everything you said are practices that I also take part in. I try to write things down because in writing it down, I somehow feel like I'm putting it in the box that Carol talked about. I'm not going to lie. There's times I just step back and take some cleansing breaths, good old meditation, a little bit of in with the good, out with the bad. And then I also lean on my tribe. I love brainstorming. And so when I feel like I am doubting myself, or I don't know if I'm making the right choice organizationally, I feel like I have a great tribe of women, and definitely some wonderful men that I work with that are also great at lifting me up and providing me with really, I think, good sound advice. And at the end of it, I just remind myself, I mean, Jenny knows me pretty well, just not take myself too seriously. So, I mean, at the end of the day, it's gonna work itself out. I think it's really my mantra. As far as your organization, I think you're so nimble. It's not a cumbersome, the fact that you have the opportunity to focus locally, it really, I think when you just hit the message of bringing people together, just like you're doing now, and maybe in the not too distant future, there will be an opportunity for us to gather safely in person. I think just more of those, a combination of virtual and in-person casual gatherings, I think are so important especially for organizations like yours that touch such a local community and a local market.
Well, Sally, my friend, we're going to close with you. And then I'm going to say about 2 things about how to get more information about us and offer huge thanks, but take us home.
Geez, Jenny, that's a lot of responsibility. I just want to say that it doesn't get acknowledged that often, but running a nonprofit is a really complicated set of skills required. And I think, we need our board members to sort of understand that, and the people on the outside to understand it. That I knew absolutely nothing about what I was doing when I came in, and I was like driving blind. That was 14 years ago. I could write a book, and I often think I could commission a book with a chapter from all of you, of your nonprofit experiences. I find reading other women's experiences, there's a lot of women in our history who've written books, whether it's Frances Perkins or Florence Kelly or Eleanor Roosevelt, who was our vice president. And I get a lot out of hearing the terrible things that happen to them, talk about sexism, talk about attacks, vicious, nasty attacks, trying to drag these organizations down. And they were up against it, and they were resilient and independent, and they knew what they had to do, and they had people, in their lifeboat with them. I always say, you have to do management, you have to be a good manager, you have to be a good fundraiser, you have to have program. Without those three legs of the stools, and who brings that skill set to the table? Those are all learned. So I'm in awe of everybody here. I just read I listened to Katie Couric's book on tape. I know that there's mixed feelings about her, but boy, did she encounter a lot of sexism, a lot of guys second guessing her. She flopped and this is Katie Couric. They had everybody's a sweetheart. Everybody loved her. So those lessons, I think, are really valuable. Everybody, please write a book. We need to hear, or maybe I'll get that chapter going in a book, because I have just learned so much. And it gives me strength to know that other women have been through what we've been through and much worse. And they have done incredible things in the world, like all of you.
Well, you are actually always, as always, Sally, you set me up to close this out perfectly. One of the things that we have been doing, to go back to Emily's point, we love to do book chats. So we've had this amazing young African-American woman who wrote a book about Black Broadway, U Street, and reading that book, and then reading another book a friend of mine, Martha Jones, a professor up at Hopkins, wrote about Vanguard. I found out about all these incredible African-American women who ran organizations that you're never taught about in your history class. Or even in your college history class. I mean, the change history in the DMV is so powerful there, and it's on the local and it's on the national, but there are organizations that were started in this region that have literally changed the lives of millions of people around the world. And we were lucky to have 6 of them, with a 7th that is sending us love and support from the Amtrak train where she is sitting on the track. So every one of you, Amy, Claudia, Deb, Sally, Carol, Emily, thank you so much for talking to our members tonight. I want you, anybody, we have information about how to find these women, how to find their organizations, to see their stories. I love the book idea. I'm sort of like, my brain is starting to spin a little bit, so I may be back. But I also want to thank Anne and the Impact Board, and Mon and Ellen, who have been kind, and Katie, who promoted this. Please help. We're going to have a recording of this. We'll share it with members. If you have women in your lives that want to be part of this, I encourage you to join. The links are in the chat, and we'll be re-promoting it. But thank you so much for allowing. This is the best way I could have started the week, the holiday season. And I look forward to seeing all of you. And again, thanks on behalf of Impact as well. Thanks, everybody. And we're only 7 minutes over. So
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you, Anne.
All right.
Thank
Bye,
you, Jenny.
everybody.
Thank you, all of you.